How do you know when you've reached UX expert status? And how do you get there? During our New York Virtual UX conference, we held a Q&A session where Jacob Nielsen offered several tips for UX practitioners looking to grow their careers. Let's say our first question is from Vinny from Rio de Janeiro. And he asked, if he doesn't have a job yet, how do you practice some of the content that you're learning during this conference, especially the ones that are, the research-based questions? How can you do that?
The first advice is a little bit silly, which is to get a job, because I do think that the best experience you comes from working on real projects in a real company with real colleagues. But of course, the way to get a job is to have something that you can prove yourself and show to the hiring managers. And so doing some projects before you get a job is definitely a great thing as well. And I think there are really two main types of projects you can do. And so they are either where you do, in some sense, kind of like your own project that you just decide to do something for your own benefit, or there's also where you do a kind of pro bono, as it's sometimes called, a project where you team up with somebody who's not paying for it, because again, you're not yet at the stage where they're going to like write you a big check, but you just work for free. So that could either be a nonprofit, or it could also be a company where, in essence, you are just working as like an unpaid intern, which is an option as well. So I think that's a different little bit between design and research for which of the two are the most recommended or the best. Because if you are a designer, you could definitely take on your own project and say, let me grab some website and just redesign it such as how I think it should be better. That's a nice thing to do, and it can kind of be nice in a portfolio to have like a real website according to your kind of approach, rather than these kind of design school projects that are kind of completely made up and irrelevant, to be honest. Most likely when I see portfolios of students, they are irrelevant designs they do. But design something real or redesign something real. The downside of that is that, of course, in real design, there are all these trade-offs that relate to the business model of what can be done, or what the engineers say, or what the boss says, and what 50 other people say. And therefore, these redesigns that people make on their own often tend to be a little bit unrealistic and maybe not compelling enough. And so that is actually a benefit of going into an organization and doing a real design project, even if you don't get paid for it. That can be something that's better to show off, because I also remember that to get hired, people don't want to just only say, well, they designed something nice. But how did they design it? What was the process? How did they overcome these various setbacks and trade-off scenarios? So that's for design. I think doing a real design, even if you don't get paid for it, is one of the ways to crank up your credentials to then later on get hired and get paid. For research, it's almost kind of the opposite, because I think if you go and do research pro bono, then often it's not going to be valued very much. If people don't pay for it, they will often tend to ignore the research findings. And also when you go and show them to others and you say, well, we did this research project for, like an opera company or something like that, and somebody is not an opera company, if they look at that and say, well, yeah, you found out how to sell tickets for Mozart, but that has nothing to do with what we are doing, even though it's actually e-commerce, right? Even if it's e-commerce for the arts, but it's still e-commerce to sell tickets. But people will often tend to ignore that. On the other hand, as a researcher, you can do some very interesting self-defined projects, which you can do studies of some design element, something that a lot of websites do. It can be something very specific, like a certain type of filtering, or it can be something more general. Like one of the projects that we have done, for example, is on investor relations areas of corporate websites. That's sort of a special area. And you can go and study that across, they say, 10 different websites. And then you can come up with some very interesting conclusions that are generalized across that. And that is a great way of showing kind of like really, hopefully anyway, very deep insights that most people have not seen before. And so I think for researchers, you can define your own project and do some research of something that you think is interesting, but it's a realistic thing that companies actually do. And you can research across websites. Or across mobile apps, or across a variety of different scenarios. And that's something that the individual people who work in a company usually don't have time for. And therefore, when they see that, it can be quite compelling often. On the other hand, if you are a designer, I would say try to go in and do a real design project. And also for writers are really in many ways, they're like designers, but they design with words. So in some sense, the same advice would apply. But I think actually one more thing writers could do, which is you can also take some sample content and rewrite, but then not just one rewrite, go back to and read the articles we've written on tone of voice. And we have a model, Kate Miranda, that the model for different parameters, different dimensions of tone of voice, and try to crank those dimensions up and down and define, let's say, 4 different tone of voice variations, and then write the same content in those 4 ways. I think that can be a very compelling way of showing off that you're a good UX writer, if you can do that well.
Thank you, Jacob. I guess kind of on that same note, Julia Dan here in the US asked, what is the one advice that you would give someone to be successful, I guess, once they're already into the UX field?
Yeah, to be successful in UX, I think one of the big things is really experience, and experience from actually doing UX, not talking about it, not sitting around in meetings. And honestly, in companies, people waste so much time in meetings. And this is one of the reasons I find it slightly irrelevant to say how many years experience does somebody have. I mean, yeah, you can have 5 years experience, but it's 5 years spent in meetings and you have not learned very much. But you can have 2 years experience and 2 years spent like cranking it out, or maybe 2 years like in the lab with users every day. And you've seen thousands of users, one-on-one. You can actually see thousands of users in 2 years if you do it every day, easily, actually. And so that's vastly more experience than spending 5 years sitting in meetings. So that would be if there's like one thing to do to build up your kind of value, is actually to work. So work really hard and say it is work to be in meetings, and it's not wasted because you learn something about how to, make friends and influence others and things, which is an important part of our job. But honestly, I think the main thing is try to minimize overhead, try to maximize productivity, and actually, particularly in research, being with users. And even if you're a designer, I would still say be with users as much as you can also, even if that's not the primary thing. But if you just sit and design, it's only for your own pleasure, and you don't get any feedback on how it actually works with real people, you're also not cranking up your skill and insight into user experience design. So even if you're not a researcher, you can still sit and observe the studies and see how people use your designs, and that's such a great learning experience. And just crank out a lot of design variations as well. Yeah, not just like the first best idea, but the 10 best ideas.
Kind of our last one around, kind of career advice and like things around how to be successful. We got one question from Charles about, is there a certain number, like how many definitions would one need to know to be a, qualified usability expert?
So how many definitions do you need to know? And the answer is definitely 1,000. I wouldn't say believe definitely, of course, I'm a little bit joking, but there's probably like about 1,000 things you need to know. There's so many different things in this field, but the better answer is really, it's not so much definitions as it is things or concepts. And there the answer is a much higher number, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably even. Some of them are very minute and small, but it's really building up your crystallized intelligence in having just seen things, a lot of different variations of things, a lot of different design variations, a lot of different platforms, computer platforms, big screens, small screens, mobile screens, stationary screens, wall size screens, voice only things, text only user interfaces. How do people operate things while they're driving their car? I mean, all these different contexts of use, different types of applications, different types of users, old users, children, teenagers, middle-aged users, people with different disabilities. It goes on and on. And so there's so many different variations of all of this. And if you go back to the theory of intelligence, we have a lot of different types of intelligence, but the two main ones are like the fluid intelligence that peaks at age 20, and then it goes down. And that's just like raw brain power. And so why is it that 20-year-old people are not the best people? And they may actually be the best people at creative poetry, but at other types of tasks, you get to get better later in life. And that's because even though fluid goes down, crystallize goes up, and so that can actually keep going up until you get dementia, actually. So it can keep going for a long time. You can just learn more and more and more things. And then when you come across a certain situation, you can use both whatever fluid intelligence you still have left to just kind of do some raw brain power thinking, but also use all the many things you've already seen. Say, oh yeah, this reminds me of that thing I thought 30 years ago in a mainframe, and this thing I saw yesterday when I was doing another thing, and reminds me of 50 other things, and that can come together and you can get a very interesting insight. So I do think that the more things, things is a very broad term here, but it's users, it's different designs, it's different technologies, it's different everything. The more different things you have seen, the better you are at getting sort of that kind of ping, it reminds me of something, and that gives you another insight.